Hello, welcome to Freedom Declared Foundation's latest State of the Nation interview, when we discuss with a guest today, Chris Ringland, to discuss the state of freedom of religion or belief within the United Kingdom. Chris joined the Evangelical Alliance as Public Policy Officer for Scotland in 2021, alongside advocacy work in the Scottish Parliament on behalf of the Evangelical Alliance's membership. He supports the work of the advocacy team across the UK, including the Cross Section podcast and the development of the Public Leadership Programme. Previously, he worked for members of the Scottish Parliament and played a key role in the Evangelical Alliance's Stories of Hope report during the COVID-19 pandemic, which received national media coverage and was debated in the Scottish Parliament. He regularly contributes to radio, podcasts, and is passionate about seeing Scotland's communities flourish and the key role of churches in bringing about cultural change and transform lives. Thank you for joining us today, Chris.
Great. Yeah, good to speak to you, James. Thanks.
The first question that we ask all our guests is, how do you define freedom of religion or belief?
Yeah, it's a big question. It's not something I think that we would kind of have a working definition that is different kind of from what's there from the UN or from the European Convention of Human Rights. But I think it's kind of a starting point. I think to be able to practice whatever your faith might be, whatever your belief might be, in a way that is completely unhindered by anybody else or by other practices, and how that might not conflict with each other. I suppose it's maybe a bit similar to the John Stuart Mill and the harm principle, that if you're not offending somebody, then you should have the freedom to do it, sort of thing. I suppose it's maybe a bit similar to that. I'm not sure, but I think where we are in Scotland specifically, in terms of freedom of religion and belief, we couldn't really say that we're particularly in a bad place, so to speak, especially if you compare it to other places in the world. But that doesn't mean that we ever shouldn't be kind of complacent about that, or expect there to be not expect there to be opposition, because of course there will be. But I think we have a good framework that we work from here in Scotland, and that impacts upon all of our legislation, of which we have quite a number of bills that are currently going through the Scottish Parliament that are maybe have some impacts upon freedom of religion and belief, and we can maybe get into that. And that was certainly the case last year with the hate crime and public order bill, which was quite famous in Scotland. So yeah, but I think generally having the position that we have now, where we can practice in our case Christian faith in a way that isn't stopped, isn't hindered, isn't prevented from being fully expressed how that might intend to be, and quite poignant since this is Easter weekend, of course.
Mm-hmm. That comparison between Scotland, the UK, and the rest of the world, I think, is very important, in that whilst we might have some concerns about some of the legislation or societal implementation of freedom of religion or belief here, we are doing a lot better than many countries around the world. But you did mention the Hate Crime Act and a couple of other bills going through the Scottish Parliament as we speak. What are those bills, and what are the potential implications on freedom of religion or belief?
Sure. So in terms of the Hate Crime and Public Order Act, as it became known, eventually there was a freedom of religion clause put into that bill as it progressed through the Parliament, when either it was realized, or as a result of lobbying, or as a result of engagement with stakeholders, the Scottish government thought that was the best way forward in order to protect freedom of religion, while also protecting people from hate crimes, which was good. And I wasn't working for them at the time, but the Evangelical Alliance contributed to that. At the moment, there are several bills which kind of touch on all this. The two main ones are probably the gender recognition reforms, which have just gone out to consultation to the public, and maybe more so the conversion therapy well, we don't have a bill as of yet, but we've had a report from the Equalities Committee in the Scottish Parliament, which recommended that there should be a bill that bans conversion therapy in the cases of sexual orientation and gender identity. and there's a bit of complications with what's devolved and what's not, and then what has gone on in at Westminster the past couple of weeks as well. So those how churches and how church leaders would continue to do their pastoral work would obviously be kind of potentially impacted by some of the aspects of those different bills. So that's something that we're working on, and that others are working on, just to ensure that there are no kind of unintended consequences for freedom of religion and belief in these kind of bills, while they are really well intentioned in terms of protecting vulnerable people from harm, because we want to see that as well. So yeah, there's a bit maybe to dig into there.
Yes, and you mentioned the gender reform bill and the potential conversion therapy bill. So it might be better to take these bill by bill.
Indeed.
So the gender reform bill, what are the potential consequences that could infringe on freedom of religion or belief from that bill?
So I'd say there's certainly less potential consequences than the conversion therapy plans, but essentially the changes that are intended in the bill is to change when someone can acquire a gender recognition certificate, which changes their legal gender identity on their birth certificate, etc., from going from 2 years to 3 months, and instead of seeing a doctor in a legal tribunal to kind of show that you have gender dysphoria or whatever it might be, scrapping that and demedicalizing it is the term, and just having it as basically a self identification. So that's kind of what is being proposed. So that maybe wouldn't directly impact upon kind of day-to-day pastoral work of churches in the same way, other than maybe the support that the pastors, ministers can give to people in their congregation who are maybe struggling with their gender identity, and how it kind of plays into all that. I suppose it's more the potential implications of conversion therapy in terms of how it might impact upon day-to-day pastoral care, especially when it comes to, when someone comes to a pastor or minister looking for support or to discuss those really kind of personal issues about their gender identity or their sexual orientation, just ensuring that support isn't unnecessarily, or not necessarily isn't criminalized in a way that's kind of not intended, so to speak. And I think that's where, especially because they're considering the model that was used in Victoria, which the state in Australia, which passed a law last year on the same issue, because we think potentially that wouldn't actually meet the requirements of the European Convention on Human Rights of freedom of religion. So there's a lot going on, but that will kind of come out as those bills progress through the Parliament. We'll be engaging with that, and other individuals and groups and church leaders will too, just to kind of make the point that we want vulnerable people to be protected. Absolutely, really well-intentioned ways forward, but that shouldn't be at the expense of, and well, it legally can't be at the expense of freedom of religion and belief.
And when concerns have been raised by yourselves and other groups to the government, to members of Parliament, how has the response been? Do they understand the importance to uphold freedom of religion or belief?
That is certainly the kind of the headline of what we've received. So there was a debate in the Parliament, and there was also the sessions which one of my colleagues contributed to, one of the evidence sessions which people can watch online of the Equalities Committee, who was considering this issue. And there's definitely a sense of which people, the MSPs and the government ministers, recognise that they don't want to impinge upon freedom of religion and belief, while recognising that the people who have had adverse experiences, sometimes that has been in a religious context, so that's kind of the complication of it. But I think the developments that have happened in Westminster over the past fortnight or so, especially with the leak that happened in terms of how the British government was going to proceed, and then it was not going to proceed, and having that U-turn when it comes to the gender identity aspect of it, and the Prime Minister kind of shifting the conversation slightly when it comes to sports and single-sex spaces and this kind of thing, which then feeds into the gender recognition reforms. It's all just kind of a bit complicated, and people and everybody recognizes that. So I think having this time now to kind of take stock and think in detail kind of about how things are going forward, that's what everybody is doing. And that's broadly the message that we received from ministers and civil servants as well.
That's encouraging to hear, because one of the recurring themes of these interviews has been a concern about the lack of religious or belief literacy within government, within the civil service, within all major political parties. So speaking just generally, not just on conversion therapy and gender recognition, what is your opinion about the state of religious and belief literacy within public life, public bodies?
I think it's actually improved quite a lot during the pandemic for different reasons. So since the pandemic, there's been kind of a regular engagement that has happened with ourselves and lots of other faith groups, from Sikhs, Muslims, Jewish communities, and other Christian expressions, Catholic, et cetera, which initially was kind of mostly about, how was COVID rules going to impact upon places of worship and that kind of thing, which is sort of morphed into a wider engagement and having more engagement with faith and belief groups, which we've really welcomed, and kind of a revision of the strategy of how the Scottish government does that. So while there's certainly always ways in which it can be improved, and I think that message has certainly got through when these sorts of bills have gone through the Parliament. That's been kind of made clear, especially last year with the Hate Crime Act. It's certainly in a better place than it was, I think. And I think the value of faith groups during the pandemic was really recognized in terms of how during the lockdowns, how they supported local communities, how they were literally essential in keeping society going. That has kind of morphed into a wider conversation about, well, actually, let's have better engagement with faith groups, and yeah, let's increase that religious literacy, and I think it's in a better place than it was, for sure.
That is also very encouraging to hear. Do you know if those those engagement groups are going to continue?
Yeah,
pandemic.
Yeah, that's definitely the plan, and we're really encouraged by that, and kind of how things develop from there, because I think it'll be really important, especially over the next year with these bills, which let's be honest, in social media and sometimes in public, it's just toxic, the kind of debate around them. So the ways in which we can bring that gracious perspective from a Christian perspective into that mix is always really good, I think, and I think that is going to continue, and we really have welcomed that.
Yes, no, that is encouraging to hear. And one thing that did happen during the pandemic was the closure of places of worship, and in the first lockdown, all governments in the UK made this decision, but in the second lockdown, the Scottish government decided to close places of worship, whilst the UK government and the Welsh government kept them open. What was your perspective on that decision?
Yeah, it was difficult, and the optics of it weren't great, and kind of how you have put it. That is how it was viewed. It was, it's open in the rest of the UK or Great Britain, but not in Scotland. And that decision, which we maybe are about to follow up with, led to a court case, which then saw that it was put then in case law that the Scottish government didn't have the legal competency to literally close places of work or prevent people from from attending places of worship, even in a public health emergency. So it was, yeah, it was difficult at the time, and we, I mean, so I wasn't working for the Evangelical Alliance at the time, but from what I understand, that yeah, they were part of the wider conversations that we said that probably shouldn't be the case, and they should be open, especially if they are in the rest of the UK, because that freedom of religion is such a fundamental part of who people are, of who not just Christians are, but of who Muslims are, and who Jewish people are, and etc. So it was it was an unfortunate kind of event that had happened, but after that things were different.
Yes, and how important do you think the court judgment is for the future implementation of freedom of religion or belief?
I think it sets quite a significant precedent, to be honest, because I don't know the exact wording off the top of my head, but I think it pretty much means that as long as we are bound by the both the kind of European Convention on Human Rights and those types of articles linked to it, then that literally can't happen legally under the competency of the Scottish government, which is really significant, and I think good to have that in the case law. So yeah, I think it has actually meant also, well, it has meant as well since that decision that, when decisions, thankfully not as much now, but when decisions had to be made about COVID rules and restrictions following that, it was obviously treated differently after that. So I think it is certainly really good and important to have that in case law for future consequences, although hopefully we will not be going into another pandemic anytime soon.
Well, hopefully not. Another thing within this one has been quite close to my heart in the past couple of weeks is last week, the Scottish Government said that it's no longer a legal requirement to wear a face covering in a place of worship. But before that announcement, it was legal to attend a pub, a nightclub, a packed football stadium without a face covering, but a place of worship, which most buildings are well ventilated, the congregation sparse, it was a legal requirement. Do you think that was a sign, again, of not truly understanding the importance of freedom of religion or belief, or do you think there's something else behind it?
It was potentially some of the former, but I think we took it at, well, we didn't agree with that decision, and we were advocating to the Scottish Government that we can't have a position where you don't have to wear a face covering in a nightclub, for example, but you do in a place of worship, especially if the justification for that was that, well, places of worship are mostly older people who are more vulnerable, because I think even between the conversation between you and I, we are not all older, although we do have to obviously put provisions in place to protect those who are more vulnerable. But we thought that what we advocated for to the Scottish Government was that those decisions about that should be made at the most kind of local level possible, with individual church leaders and elders or wider denominations, if that's appropriate, rather than at a state level, especially in the past couple of weeks when it's been one of the only places left that has had it. It has looked, and in the rest of the UK and the Republic of Ireland, you haven't had to wear one. It has, it hasn't always, the optics of that haven't always looked brilliant, but I think to be fair to the nightclubs, yes, they were closed for a long time, and in terms of the economic effects of that and all the rest of it, but I don't think that still should have been a reason why places of worship then, to balance that out, had to then wear face coverings, etc., while providing provision for those who are more vulnerable. So yeah, we took it at face value from what they said to us, that it was based partly on the science of the data of the distribution of the virus, but also that for these places to be able to open as well. But potentially there was an element of maybe not recognizing the importance to individuals of of going to their place of worship, especially after 2 years of wearing a mask. It was quite a big day last Sunday. I certainly found the singing was it was quite a moment, I think, after 2 years of singing with a mask on.
Yeah, no, I felt that as well when I attended. Just whilst it's the same worship happening, same service, same mass, it did feel like a liberation just going on, not having a face mask, the
Yeah.
singing being much louder, more clear. It did feel like a significant moment, considering everything in the past 2 years. Another area which perhaps Scotland and Northern Ireland, compared to the rest of the United Kingdom, has struggles with freedom of religion or belief, is the cultural historic divide between Catholics and Protestants, and the tension there. And whilst it's not as obvious today, that division is there, there is still some things like the football, it can come to the rise. How do you think Scotland is doing in overcoming that conflict, and how can we improve?
Yeah, I suppose it's quite an interesting question to ask me personally. With my, I suppose I've two hats of my where I was born and raised, but from my accent you can probably tell. But yes, working and based in Scotland. Yeah, I think I mean, in the time that I have been based in Scotland at that kind of very local level, and what I've kind of observed, I think things are definitely in a better place than it was. And I think for the Scottish government to put forward and to pass for example, the hate crime act last year was probably a recognition of the fact that there's maybe still a bit too much of things like that go on. And there was they often talked about as well during that process about a bill that was passed in the Parliament a couple of years ago about violence or about chanting at football matches, which ended up being quite a complex bit of legislation that didn't hugely work very well. So I think there, depending on where you are in Scotland, there maybe is more to do. But I think in general terms, and I suppose based on my experience of growing up in Northern Ireland, I think Scotland is in a pretty good place, but maybe it's really individual local community levels, which is where the role of the churches and of both Protestant churches and Catholic churches, it is really important to have that unity at that local level, and that filtering out into local communities more widely, especially when it comes to the football.
Yes, and in an interview with Bishop John Keenan, he said that in Scotland, the legal framework for freedom of religion or belief is good, but the implementation of it in society is not necessarily felt. That wasn't just in relation to the historic divisions, but just in general. Would you share a similar opinion, or where would you disagree?
I wouldn't necessarily like disagree as kind of strongly as that, but yeah, I suppose I can certainly see where he is coming from. And maybe I do differ slightly maybe from some others, which is fair enough. That I think broadly it's both. We do have that good statutory and legal framework, and generally that might obviously that's where these discussions come in about the bills that are being going through the Parliament at the moment, and how that impacts churches at that kind of local level. Of course, there are issues that can stem from the way that society is compared to what it used to be, and a general lack of religious literacy of maybe like local councils or that kind of thing, and how churches are granted access to buildings or that kind of thing is maybe where the rubber hits the road the most. But in general, I think we're still, I just have to compare it, internationally or historically, that I think we're in a pretty good place, and we will obviously be advocating for that to continue indefinitely and to improve, obviously.
Yes, and in what ways do you think we can improve in Scotland?
I think it's a wider. I don't think it's something that can be done very easily, but I think it's a wider cultural societal thing. I especially think through the maybe the 2010s and maybe the 2000s as well. There's just been, I think it's starting to change a little bit. I think, and that's been kind of shown through these bills and how they've progressed and the MSP's views on them and everything. I think there's been a massive general swathe of religious literacy that has come about just as a result of people not wanting to be involved in churches, not wanting to be involved in their their local parish and whatever that might look like, and the kind of globalized nature of the world, and where people are getting their content and news from, and in a whole kind of wider sense like that. So I think the potential that the better improvements in relations from the pandemic in local communities that faith groups have onwards, I think that has started to shift the dial slightly in terms of, well, actually, why are these individuals, these churches, these places of worship, that why are they doing what they do? Why are they helping their local communities in the way that they do? And why are they so selfless in doing so? It's because of what they believe, and rather than that being like something to avoid, it's actually something to embrace. I think we're a long way away from Richard Dawkins, from atheism being kind of the thing at the minute. I think we're quite a long way away from that, and we've moved past that into a stage of, well, the country is very secular, but it's also welcoming to religious communities. That's where I think we're at anyway.
And that's a good place to be, and if it does continue to improve, then that is very encouraging. On the bills, for people listening, what's the best way for them to try and ensure that MSPs are aware of the potential threats and increase the religious literacy of the MSPs that represent them?
Sure. So at a higher level, over the next couple of weeks, the gender recognition reforms, they have gone out to the public to give their views to, which anyone can. And us at the Evangelical Alliance will be putting out a guide and how, if you want to fill in that consultation and make your views known, how you can do that. You can also very easily email your MSP through the Parliament website, and there's other ways to do that too, which I can link to. And in terms of conversion therapy, I think from what I understand, there is going to be a report published as a result of this working group, and then in the summer it's going to go out to consultation, although the timings might be different about that. I think that's what they said in the Parliament. So that'll be another opportunity to make their views known. But I think the biggest thing people actually can do, because we can email our MSPs or tweet them and that kind of thing, but if there's a way to possibly have a conversation over Zoom or in person with them, that I think that's the most effective way to do it, in that kind of way that's face to face in some way, and to show where you come from, and to why you might have the views that you do based on your religious faith, because I think that kind of dialogue and that conversation, especially for MSPs, is really good and healthy for both them to hear and for their constituents to hear too, where they're coming from, and that's the best way forward. So yeah, those are a couple of different ways, as well as just keeping informed as to what is going on too.
Great. And yeah, in the video description, I will add the part in the Scottish Parliament website where it gives you all your MSP email addresses, so people can find it easily. Is there anything else that you would like to cover in this conversation?
No, I think that was good. It was great to have a chat with you, James.
No, it was great having you on, Chris, and thank you for giving up some of your time to share your thoughts on the state of freedom of religion or belief within Scotland and the wider United Kingdom context. For people listening, to stay up to date with the latest interviews, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media, Twitter and Facebook, you'll find us both with Freedom Declared. And yes, thank you once again, Chris, for your time. And yes, thanks for listening.